Hello, I'm Wout, and I will be presenting to you an interactive graph of Gapminder. I chose as my y-axis investments as a percentage of GDP and income per person, GDP per capita based on purchasing power parity inflation adjusted as my x-axis for Albania, Cambodia, and Iceland. I chose investments as a percentage of GDP because it gives you a clear indication of the amount of money invested compared to the average GDP, and income per person, GDP per capita based on purchasing power parity adjusted for inflation, because GDP is a good indicator when you have countries that are stable, and these three have periods of true instability and to this day remain quite unstable. So we'll start off with Cambodia. Sihanouk's political neutrality had a significant effect on Cambodia's economic development. Sihanouk insisted that the economic neutrality meant either total rejection of international aid or acceptance of foreign economic assistance from all countries without strings attached. Indeed, during the first decade that he was in power in newly independent Cambodia, from 1953 to 63, the prince sought economic assistance from the east and the west. In 1963, however, Cambodia's economy started to stagnate when Sihanouk decided to link his economic neutrality to the country's territorial integrity and border security. He rejected further assistance from the United States and Thailand. Sihanouk also nationalized trading companies, banks, insurance, and major industries, thereby causing economic deterioration between 1963 and 1969. Also, on January 1969, President Richard M. Nixon takes office as the new President of the United States. In February the same year, President Nixon authorizes Operation Menu, the bombing of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong bases within Cambodia. Over the following 4 years, U.S. forces will drop more than 500,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia. This is exactly what expresses the sudden drop in the income per person. On April 29, 1970, South Vietnamese troops attack into Cambodia. The war that engulfed the rest of Indochina spread to Cambodia in April 1997, shortly after the coup that deposed Prince Sihanouk. Wartime conditions had a major impact on the country's economy, especially on the export sector. Production and export of all commodities dropped sharply. Combat in the nation's most densely populated farming areas caused a large segment of the peasant population to flee to cities and to towns. Moreover, the war seriously dislocated the economic system. Food shortages arose as revolts interrupted the transportation of crops from the countryside to the main market. Increasing budgetary expenditures, skyrocketing inflation, shrinking export earnings plagued the war-torn economy. In January 1979, the Khmer People's Revolutionary Party, led by General Secretary Heng Samrin, set Cambodia's economic development policies. The first 5-year program of socio-economic restoration and development, from 1986 to 90, was put to action agreed upon in Ho Chi Minh City. Growth resumed and has remained about 5% during 2000 to 2003. Tourism was Cambodia's fastest growing industry, with arrivals up 34% in 2000 and up another 40% in 2001. The economy of Cambodia continued to grow and achieved a further level of income per person over the next couple of years. Now for Albania. For Albania, we had a consistent drop from pretty much 1980 to 1989. In 1976, the People's Assembly would not follow any foreign aid from a capitalist source. In 1978, China ended all aid to Albania. Albania's leaders then began promoting a system of autarky. However, autarky was unsuccessful. Albania suffered two of its worst years in 1984 and 1985. By the late 1980s, communist governments in Eastern Europe were being demolished slowly. Capitalism was reintroduced into the region, which influenced change in Albania. The coalition government fell, and in 1992 the Albanian Democratic Party took over the government and introduced their economic reforms based on market economies. In 1990 we had a large drop. Since 1990, a transformation toward a free market economy has been going on. Industrial production declined by about 50% in 1991. From 1991 to 1995 we had a consistent increase. Most agriculture, state housing, and small industry were privatized. This trend continued with the privatization of transport services and small and medium-sized enterprises. In 1995, the government began privatizing large state enterprises. After reaching a low point in the early 1990s, The economy slowly expanded again, reaching its 1989 level by the end of the decade. 1996 through 1997, we had a small drop. The speed and vigor of private entrepreneurial response to Albania's opening and liberalizing was better than expected. Beginning in 1995, however, progress stalled, with negligible GDP growth in 1996 and a 9% contraction in 1997. 1998 through 2001, we had a significant increase. The new government installed in July 1997 has taken strong measures to restore public order and to revive economic activity and trade. And then from 2005 to 2008, we had a general increase. The completion of a new thermal power plant near Vlorë has helped diversify generation capacity and plans to improve transmission lines between Albania and Montenegro and Kosovo would help relieve the energy shortages. Also, with help from EU funds, the government is taking steps to improve the poor national road and rail network, a long-standing barrier to sustained economic growth. Albanian GDP real growth was 3.7%. Year after year, the tourism sector has gained a growing share in the country's GDP. And lastly, we'll go to Iceland. Iceland, from 1965 to 1970, had a relative stability in investments, but it has an increase in GDP. In the 1950s, there was a series of ups and downs, mostly because of poor fishing catches, strikes, and erratic exchange rates. The economy was very low, and in 1960, the government had to change the whole economic system, including taxation, currency, and the housing policy of the state. The economy recovered in the 1990s, but the Icelandic economic system is small, and when herring fishing failed in 1967 and the Pope allowed the Catholic to eat meat on Fridays, many people lost their jobs. Several of them emigrated to Sweden and even to Australia to look for a job. The economy recovered and reached a peak in 1974. From 1974 to about 1995, we had a general increase in investments, yet a smaller but present increase in GDP. In 1991, the Independence Party led by Davio Oddsson formed a coalition government with the Social Democrats. This government set in motion market liberalization policies, privatizing a number of small and large companies. At the same time, economic stability increased and previously chronic inflation was drastically reduced. From 2000 to 2006, we had a large increase in investments. In 1995, the Independence Party formed a coalition government with the Progressive Party. This government continued with the free market policies, privatizing 2 commercial banks and the state-owned telecom. Corporate income tax was reduced to 18%. Nordic Tiger was a term used to refer to the period of economic prosperity in Iceland that began in the post-Cold War 1990s. From 2006 to 2001, we had a large decrease in investments and a slight decrease in GDP. The Nordic Tiger period ended in 2008 when the country's major banks failed and were taken over by the government. The Icelandic Central Bank approached the Bank of England in March 2008 for assistance to support its currency as confidence in its heavily indebted banking system began to ebb away. Following sharp inflation in the Icelandic krona during 2008, the 3 major banks in Iceland were placed under government control. A subsidiary of Landsbanki, which operated in the UK and the Netherlands, was declared insolvent, putting the savings of thousands of UK and Dutch customers at risk. It also transpired that over 70 local authorities in the UK held more than 550 million of cash in Icelandic banks, in response to statements that accounts of UK depositors would not be guaranteed. The British governments seized assets of the banks and the Icelandic government. Thank you for listening.